So the IMF has published its latest economic forecast this week, and they have upgraded global growth. Global growth of 3% this year, up from 2.8, 3.1% next year, up from 3%. Basically, because I think they were expecting tariffs to be higher as a result of the Donald Trump negotiations with countries around the world. They were expecting an effective tariff on imports to the US of 24%. They've now downgraded that to 17%. I mean, it's still a big rise in tariffs. It's still going to depress growth around the world, but not as much as was previously thought. And therefore, the UK is now expected to be the third fastest growing economy this year and next, after America and Canada, with, again, a very small upgrade in growth. Growth this year expected to be 1.2%, up from 1.1% in their last forecast, and next year unchanged at 1.4%. Still pretty dismal growth rates, but a little bit of good news. The Donald Trump negotiations have not ended up with the scale of trade war that some feared a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's still, as you say, pretty dismal growth, but it's not. It's flat rather than, you know, a global recession, which people were speculating might be happening because of the trade wars. And that's because, you know, Trump is concluding these deals, although he might reopen the Canadian negotiations, as we just discussed. And the European Union deal, it is worse than the one that the UK got. And I think it's a tribute to the UK negotiators, who I was told by them at the time, you know, the EU were like, well, why did you sign up to that? That was a mistake. But in fact, the EU would happily have taken the British trade deal this week. Of course, you know, it does sort of beg the question, if Britain had still been in the EU. We always focus on what it's meant for Britain leaving the EU, but we don't focus so much on what it means for the EU that Britain left. But Britain actually could have given the EU a stronger negotiating hand in its conversations with Washington. If we'd still been
rather than seeing this as a Brexit dividend, you're seeing it as an EU Brexit deficit.
Yeah, I think the EU is suffering from the loss of Britain in things like its approach to financial regulation and its relationships with the United States, and indeed security issues. But just coming back to the kind of domestic situation, I mean, if you're Rachel Reeves, I think you had a very bad time a few weeks ago with the U-turn on the disability benefits that was imposed on you, and she was under a huge amount of pressure. I guess, you know, things have been a little bit calmer going into the summer, but it's all about to kick off, isn't it, in the autumn? Because still with this sort of disappointing growth, you know, with the numbers that we've seen on the public finances and borrowing, with the GDP numbers in the UK, these are not the forecasts, but the actual GDP or the first estimates of GDP for April and May, both negative. So we're on the cusp potentially, you know, of a negative quarter and a recession. You know, all of these things still mean she's got an incredibly difficult job at the time of the budget. And it's pretty clear she can't squeeze spending anymore. And she set the envelope for that. So, you know, this big issue remains, are taxes going to go up? And that can only hit what is already very kind of weak consumer and business sentiment about the UK at the moment.
That's right. I think it's important to kind of stand back and look at this in a broader context. Before I do, I mean, just to say, Rachel Reeves, her ratings have been hit very hard. She's now more unpopular in the latest Ipsos polling than Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn, Kemi Badenoch. But she's doing a tour around the country. She's doing visits. She's getting out there. She's trying to get things back on track, and that'll be a good thing for her to do. But if you just kind of, as I said, stand back and think about, you know, the Brown years, the Osborne years, and where we are. In the Brown years, we hadn't had the global pandemic, the financial crisis, when he was Chancellor, and we had high interest rates relative to today, but a low level of national debt relative to today, and actually quite strong economic growth. I mean, growth rates more than double the growth rates the IMF have just said that the UK is going to have in the next couple of years. If you then move forward to your period, you had higher debt, big rise in the national debt because of the global financial crisis. You had slower growth. Global growth was much slower everywhere after the financial crisis, but you had an unusual period of very low interest rates globally compared to the past, which meant servicing that debt was easier. Jump forward to 2025, Rachel Reeves has now had not just the global financial crisis, but also the pandemic. And as a consequence, much higher levels of national debt than we've seen really since the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. She's got growth rates which are much lower than we saw in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. But she's also, compared to your period, seeing this big jump up in interest rates. And that is such a terribly difficult combination. If you've got high debt, high interest rates, but low growth, very hard to kind of get out of that sort of trap. And the danger is, if the underlying real interest rate is the same or higher than your growth rate, then your fiscal situation just gets worse. And so this is, independent of any decision she made in the last year, this is a structurally very difficult position for the British economy. And as you say, going into this autumn budget, I mean, people are debating whether the fiscal gap to meet her fiscal rules is 20 or 25 or 30 billion pounds a year. Some people are saying more than that. Whatever it is, it's a big fiscal gap. Hard to see how you could possibly do that, close that by cutting public spending. Hard to see how you could possibly close that by increasing borrowing. Welfare reform is now not going to deliver cuts this year. So the question is going to be about what decision she makes on tax. And I think going into this this summer, I think the question in my mind is, how much is the Treasury preparing the ground? How much is Rachel Reeves softening us up for very difficult tax decisions to come? And so far, I'm not really seeing that. There's been a debate about wealth taxes, and then that's now been dismissed. No conversation about how an assumption that all those tax promises made at election time are going to carry on. But what is the way through this on tax? And to what extent is the Treasury starting a public conversation about these massive challenges? And so far, I don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, this week, Ray Dalio, who's a legendary Wall Street investor, set up a very successful firm called Bridgewater. And he said the UK is in a debt doom loop. And he singled out the UK as being particularly vulnerable to this, even among other countries in, for example, Western Europe, who are in a difficult situation. And it's the high debt, it's the high cost of servicing that debt, it's the low growth, as you say. And that then begs a question, like, what can this economy afford? And because it's a Labour government, and because they said they wanted to end austerity, and because they've had these rebellions on their attempts to cut back some of the public expenditure bills on things like disability benefits and winter fuel payments, they're not really confronting the question that I think I would have asked the country to confront at a time like this, which is, we're just not as rich as we were. We're not growing as much as we are. The cost of servicing our debts is becoming a bigger and bigger issue for us. Investor confidence is weak. The bond market, which lends us this money, is asking searching questions. We can't afford the state that we've got at the moment. And she can't at the moment she's not engaging in that question. So then you have to go, well, what can we do to afford the state we got if the economy is not going to be growing in the way that we want and debt interest is taking more and more of that money? We're going to have to raise taxes. But the problem with the raising of taxes, and I agree, she's not really laying the ground for it. And it's not, by the way, just the pre-election promises. It's the promise she made at the CBI last autumn, which we played a clip of on this podcast, when she was Chancellor, saying, I'm not coming back for more taxes. But there is no other, what is the other kind of exit door from this situation? But it's incredibly hard to see where she would get the money from in those taxes, or that, the raising of taxes wouldn't contribute to this malaise about the UK. I'll give you two voices that have spoken out this week. Very different voices. So the first is the global chief executive of Goldman Sachs, the investment bank. And, he says, if you create a tax policy or incentives that push people away, then you harm your economy. And he is talking to the fact that there has been an exodus of entrepreneurial and wealthy people from the UK and international people from Britain because of things like the changes to the non-dom regime that happened, to be fair, under the Conservatives, but added to under Labour. But then you've even had Gary Neville, the footballer and big Keir Starmer supporter before the election, who did that party election broadcast kind of walking with Keir in the Lake District, coming out and saying, well, this big rise in national insurance has certainly hit employment, and I wouldn't have done that. So, I think it's all very well for sort of people on the centre left to say, okay, well, she's got to raise taxes. But that is, you then do get into this doom loop where you raise taxes, sentiment is hit, businesses don't want to invest, your economy, continues therefore to underperform. And I think she has to be very, very careful, and has to, in the end, we're going to have to confront this question of how much the country can afford. I just heard the news today. We've got the biggest civil service for 20 years, and it's gone up a third since Brexit. Well, I mean, what are we doing about that?
So the doom loop Ray Dalio is talking about is a thing which she's absolutely clear she's not going to do, which is if in the end your debt interest payments are rising because growth is low and the taxes aren't coming in and you've got big debt service payments, then you end up borrowing more and your debt GDP ratio rises. That's your doom loop. And I don't think she can afford to go down that road for the reasons he says, which is that that you end up in a Liz Truss style crisis. We had a Liz Truss doom loop and we don't want to have a Rachel Reeves doom loop. So then the question becomes, are we going to be bailed out by stronger economic growth? It's not going to happen this year or next year. The IMF forecast is absolutely clear about that. And, the Treasury can't just hope that somebody's going to turn up in the next month or two, because it's not. And I think there is a sense at the moment when you listen to the government's communication that it's like they're not wanting to talk about this big choice that you're framing, because in the hope that, well, maybe we'll be bailed out of this, or maybe we are going to have stronger growth. That isn't going to happen. Is there any prospect of this Labour government? Look, of course they should make savings where they can, and maybe there are too many civil servants in some departments, but they are not going to solve a 20 to 30 billion pound fiscal gap with cuts in public spending or welfare spending in a way which will meet that fiscal test in the next 3 months. So the only thing which is going to happen is tax rises, unless they're going to fall into the debt borrowing trap. There isn't another way out of it between now and the budget, as far as I can see. Not one the markets will believe in, because non-credible public spending numbers aren't going to work for them either. And that's where you get to the question of narrative and framing and preparing the ground. Is the government saying on tax, here is a process which is going to show us where we can tackle avoidance and abuse and things which might throw up some more revenue for the future? Is the government saying, here are the 3 massively difficult and controversial decisions we have to make on growth right now to show people we're serious? Is the government saying to business and to the wider public, given what's happening with Trump and defence and war and the state of our economy and growth, these are the decisions on tax we're going to have to make together, and here is the prize which can come for that? I don't see any of that framing happening, but I think
they can't blame Trump, can they? If, well, at the same time saying that their trade deal with Trump is one of the big achievements of the government. I mean, isn't that a challenge for them?
Completely. Look. But the big achievement of the government is not to have a trade deal as bad as Europe's or Japan's. But the idea is good news for Britain. I mean, what has happened is a big tax rise for American consumers, which is going to hit British exports. And in terms of our service exports, there's nothing in this American trade deal to give us any boost to growth. There is nothing going to happen which improves our growth prospects for that trade deal. The only point is it could have been worse. But the status quo is not good. It is bad. So I just feel as though going into the conferences and into the budget, you have to make a strategic decision about your communication, your framing, and then go after it. And, I think you're clear that you would say the country can't afford where we are, and therefore we are going to make big, difficult decisions. I don't know whether the cuts happen in defence. I don't think that's what you'd want. The health service, well, I think all the pressure is in the opposite direction. In education, really. Where else is it going to happen?
Welfare would be the...
Well, okay,
I can see why that's where she wanted to be. I mean, that's, by the way, she wanted this message, which is we're making savings in welfare.
But I mean,
she's been pushed
but
off
even then, the welfare savings were 5 billion a year, and the gap is 4 to 5 times that. But that's gone. So, what is now the strategy for communication through to the autumn? And
the pension age is speculated on, isn't it? I mean, they've launched a new review of that, and although that doesn't bring immediate savings, pension age is going up to 66, 67. I think the fact that does bring kind of credibility for international investors that you're dealing with your longer term costs, and lots of other Western countries haven't been as bold on that. We've had one of our regular listeners has sent us in a suggestion. Here's a question from Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, who sent this into the show.
Hi, Ed and George, friend of the show, Mel Stride here. I wanted to ask you a bit of a techie point about the options Rachel Reeves might be thinking about for the autumn. The government has said that they aren't going to change their fiscal rules, but as you know, there is also a wider set of requirements called the fiscal framework. That includes, for example, a rule which says that the government can miss its main fiscal target by 0.5% of GDP once the third year of the forecast becomes the target year. Bringing that flexibility forwards in the autumn could be worth 15 billion or so of extra headroom, allowing even more borrowing. If the Chancellor did make that change, would this not be a clear breach of faith, given the commitments she's made? And how do you think the bond markets might react?
I think it is smart of Mel Stride to be sending us this question and calling this out at the moment. He thinks there is something here which might happen, a ruse which will allow her to borrow more. He's trying to call it out in advance. I have to say, I think it is very hard for Rachel Reeves to do this. If I might say, it's exactly the kind of thing that George Osborne would have done in 2011 or 2012, whether it was Swiss tax avoidance or student loans, a way of sort of a bit of sleight of hand. You were very good at that, but it was a different time politically. Rachel Reeves has already changed her fiscal rules last autumn to give her more room for borrowing on capital. She said the fiscal rules are cast iron, and a change which now happened in a sleight of hand way to allow her to borrow more while saying she's consistent with her fiscal rules. I think that is very hard for her to do now. I thought it was possible to do that at the beginning of the year in an international move on defence. You could imagine it happening on an international move around climate change. But for it to happen now, driven by the UK and this Chancellor, to allow more short-term borrowing, but that absolutely opens up your Ray Dalio critique. So good call, Mel. I think it's very hard for that to have happened even before you sent us your voicemail.
Well, I think look, it is part of the framework. She wouldn't be breaking the framework, but she would be breaking the rules she committed to. In the end, I remember our friend Nick Macpherson, the permanent secretary at the Treasury when I was a Chancellor, or most of the time I was Chancellor. He would say, like, these fiscal rules, I'm not myself particularly wedded to them, and what markets care about, what people who lend money to Britain care about, is, are you actually taking concrete steps? And that's why things like the defeat or the U-turn in the House of Commons on welfare cuts is so damaging. So I think you could possibly get away with this. Say, look, it's consistent with my fiscal framework, but to reassure investors that Britain is going to live within its means, I am taking these steps, which might include, if you're a Labour Chancellor, a big tax rise. Or indeed, there was a Tory Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, who increased national insurance. So you can raise taxes, you can bring in further expenditure cuts or welfare cuts or things like I mentioned on the pension age. So if you had something kind of concrete in policy terms alongside it, you might be able to get away with it. But, it's hard. And the trouble is, this is not, as we've discussed before, it's not an exact science. There's not someone who tells you this is what the bond market's going to do. If everyone knew what the bond market was going to do tomorrow, they'd be billionaires because there's a lot of people who spend their time trying to guess what the bond market's going to do tomorrow. And so I think, you would, as you say, be running quite a risk. And that for the Labour government would be fatal. I mean, if you're looking at all the things that are kind of politically fatal for Labour, The biggest would be a bond market crisis, a kind of Liz Truss moment. And as for Mel Stride, we should perhaps just pause and, as Shadow Chancellor, he kept his job in the reshuffle that Kemi Badenoch had a couple of weeks ago. I should say, by the way, someone from the Tory High Command messaged me after our discussion on the Badenoch reshuffle and said you should have also paid attention to the important changes at Conservative Central Office, and we'll note those, maybe come back in the autumn when we look at the Tory Party conference to what's going on in the kind of Tory campaigning machine. But in terms of Mel Stride, I think he's doing a good job. He's a kind of reassuring individual. He's the challenge for a Shadow Chancellor, we've both done that job, is could you see this person, in charge of the nation's finances? I think you could see Mel Stride in charge of the nation's finances. I think that kind of his big move, which is to say never again Liz Truss, that speech he gave, which we discussed, was exactly what the Conservatives need to do. And is sort of equivalent to some of the manoeuvres that we tried to make when we were in opposition. But he hasn't really been backed up enough by everyone else, including the Tory leader. I mean, Kemi Badenoch is definitely talking about the economy much more, but she hasn't taken risks, and I don't think it's such a big risk, frankly, to say Liz Truss, never again. And that would set her up, by the way, and set Mel Stride up, if there were to be a bond market crisis this autumn, to say, well, we warned about this and we have said never again on our watch. So I think he's doing a good job. He just doesn't have quite the support he needs from the shadow First Lord of the Treasury.
That may be right, although, look, it's just such a hard job at this stage in a parliament to be Shadow Chancellor. I mentioned the Ipsos polling about Rachel Reeves. People know who she is, and they're definitely hearing from her a lot, whatever they may think. Recent polling on which of the following members of the opposition do you remember seeing, reading or hearing something about in the past couple of weeks? And it was Robert Jenrick, 18%, Priti Patel, 13%, Mel Stride, 9%, none of these, 49%. Andrew Griffith was down at 4%. Hard to kind of break through if you're the Shadow Chancellor. The temptation is to go after something really easy on tax or spending. The temptation is to say that these tax rises from the government are a terrible betrayal, and immediately you're into so are you going to reverse them? And if you don't reverse them, then your attack doesn't really kind of hit home. And if you are going to reverse them, you've suddenly left yourself hugely exposed at the beginning of a parliament. Not easy to get off those tax and spending commitments. What you need is some kind of intellectual, structural diagnosis, which is not simply about the particular level of interest rates, taxation or spending, which allows you to say that we get it and understand it and they don't. And I think if it was me, I think I would be going more on the nature of the enterprise economy. Do they really understand what makes business work, what makes investment work, what makes entrepreneurs take risks, venture capitalists invest in Britain? I would be looking at something which was more thematic about they don't get the economy in the way in which we do. I feel as though, look, I thought Mel Stride's speech about Liz Truss was a good speech, but I feel as though the Tories have tried lots of different economic messages in the last few months without really landing on one. And the simple, easy one to land on would almost certainly be the wrong one to land on. So structurally, very tough thing for him. But he needs to work out what his underlying critique is and to be able to stick with that for the next couple of years. He doesn't want to be writing a shadow budget in 2025.
No, I think that's right. And, the question, where's your growth plan, is the one you want to be asking the Labour government at the moment. I mean, I think those kind of numbers about, who has heard from the shadow cabinet are always a bit misleading. I remember when I was working for William Hague, they used to run these polls and they used to put into the polling, like, who is a member of the shadow cabinet? Is it Liam Fox or, is it, Andrew Lansley or whatever it happens to be? Or they would then put in, or is it Pitt the Younger or Benjamin Disraeli? Or they put in these figures from history, and the public would go, yeah, I think Pitt the Younger's in the shadow cabinet. So, you can play these games. I think it's more important. I mean, look, obviously the Shadow Chancellor has to first of all, from their own point of view, survive a parliament, and that's quite hard. There's usually several shadow chancellors in a parliament, so staying on the horse is quite important, and trying to be there at the end. But and it's more important ultimately what people think as you get close to an election. This is particularly true of the party leader, actually, and you are laying the groundwork now. You're saying the right things about the economy, and I think for an opposition, any opposition, you've got to start with a big reassurance message. Do you understand why we were kicked out? Because by definition, you're in opposition because someone's kicked you out, usually on for economic reasons, and you're going to fix that, and and it's not going to happen again. I mean, so I would be, if I was him, I would be kind of pushing ahead on his stability message, on his bond market message, on his no Liz Truss again message, and Rachel Reeves is risking that message.
What we can absolutely guarantee is that Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, will be hoping to go on holiday in August, but they will have hanging over them the conference speeches they will make at the end of September and the budgets they will give or respond to a couple of months after. And anytime they're feeling a bit relaxed on a beach in the middle of August, suddenly they'll think, what am I going to say in my conference speech? What is going to be my core message? How am I going to prepare the ground for this or that? And in August, as a Chancellor or Shadow Chancellor, there is no escape.